What if the reason people ignore you is not because you are weak, but because you are speaking too much? What if your explanations are not clarifying your value, but dissolving it? And what if the moment you fall silent, the world finally begins to listen? There is a quiet truth most people never learn. They believe power comes from being understood, from being liked, from being chosen, so they chase, they beg, they explain, and every time they do, something within them fractures. Because the psyche does not respect what pleads for approval. I will not teach you how to speak better. I will teach you when silence transforms you. If you stay with me until the end, you will understand why the most dominant presence in any room is often the one saying the least, and why withdraw your words at the right moment rewires how others perceive your value forever. From the very beginning, the human mind is taught a subtle bargain: acceptance in exchange for effort, love in exchange for performance, safety in exchange for obedience. Long before we learn who we are, we learn how to be chosen. A smile becomes a strategy. Silence becomes fear. Expression becomes currency. And without realizing it, the inner world starts organizing itself around one central question: what must I become so I am not abandoned? This question does not shout, it whispers. It hides behind politeness, overthinking, and the constant urge to explain oneself. It creates individuals who mistake attention for connection and validation for worth. The tragedy is not that people want to be chosen, it is that they forget they were whole before the choosing began. The psyche is deeply symbolic. It does not understand social rules the way the conscious mind does. It understands posture, direction, movement. When someone chases approval, the unconscious records a single message: I am lacking. This message is not neutral. It shapes identity. Over time, the individual no longer seeks alignment, they seek relief. Relief from the anxiety of not being wanted. Relief from the discomfort of standing alone in one's own truth. And so they chase not always physically, but emotionally, psychologically, energetically. They reply faster than they should. They tolerate what feels wrong. They soften boundaries they never wanted to explain in the first place. All of this happens quietly, beneath awareness, while the conscious mind calls it love, kindness, or patience. The illusion is convincing. It says that effort creates value, that persistence earns respect, that if one explains clearly enough, proves consistently enough, bends carefully enough, understanding will arrive. But the unconscious world does not operate on effort alone. It operates on balance. What moves towards something too forcefully creates resistance. What collapses inward invites domination. The more someone positions themselves as needing to be chosen, the more they surrender the very authority that would make them desirable in the first place. This is not a moral failure. It is a psychological law. Energy flows toward coherence, not desperation. When a person believes their worth is conditional, they begin to live in fragments. One part observes, another part performs, another part negotiates. Authenticity becomes risky because it threatens the bond. So the self is edited. The sharp edges are dulled. The needs are postponed. The truth is delayed until it becomes resentment. What appears on the surface as loyalty or devotion is often a fear-based attachment to external validation. The self no longer stands upright, it leans. And anything that leans for too long forgets how to stand on its own. Chasing is rarely about the other person. It is about fleeing one's own inner silence. Stillness confronts the individual with unanswered questions. Who am I without their response? What do I feel when no one reassures me? What remains when the audience leaves? These questions unsettle the ego, because the ego survives through reflection. It wants to be seen, mirrored, confirmed. So it moves outward, compulsively. It fills the space with words, explanations, gestures, offerings. It mistakes motion for power. But power does not rush. Power attracts. The moment someone begins to chase, the psychological dynamic shifts. The axis of control quietly rotates. One person becomes the evaluator, the other the applicant. This happens without discussion, without intention, without malice. The unconscious simply assigns roles based on behavior. The one who waits becomes the reference point. The one who pursues becomes reactive. Over time, the pursuer loses their center. Their emotional state becomes dependent on response, tone, timing. A delayed reply can destabilize them. A small sign of approval can intoxicate them. This is not connection. This is conditioning. Begging emerges when chasing no longer works. It appears as emotional transparency, as vulnerability, as honesty. But underneath there is urgency, a tightening of the psyche, a fear of loss so strong that dignity feels negotiable. The individual begins to expiate themselves, not to be understood but to be spared. They narrate their intentions, justify their feelings, clarify their boundaries until the boundaries disappear. The unconscious message sent is unmistakable. My reality needs permission to exist. And once that message is sent repeatedly, it becomes identity. What follows is erosion. Not dramatic but gradual. Self-respect thins. Intuition grows quiet. The inner voice that once warned, hesitated, or resisted learns it will not be heard. The person becomes outwardly accommodating and inwardly divided. They sense the imbalance but explain it away. They call it patience, they call it maturity, they call it love, but the body knows, the nervous system knows. It tightens in the presence of what feels unsafe, even if the mind insists otherwise. The paradox is that the more someone tries to secure a bond through effort, the less secure it becomes. Human attraction, emotional, psychological, even social response to groundedness, to someone who occupies their space without apology, to someone who does not rush to be understood because they understand themselves. When a person stops chasing, they are not withdrawing affection, they are reclaiming authorship. They are saying without words, I am not running from myself to reach you. Silence terrifies the ego because it removes the illusion of control. Words feel like tools. Explanations feel like bridges, but often they are shields against rejection. Silence, on the other hand, RCS truth to surface. It allows the dynamic to reveal itself without interference. Who reaches out when you stop? Who respects you when you no longer persuade? Who remains when you no longer perform? These answers are unbearable for someone who has built their identity around being chosen, because silence risks discovery. That some bonds existed only because of effort, not resonance, yet this is precisely where power returns. When chasing stops, the psyche recenters. Energy that once flowed outward begins to circulate inward. The individual feels discomfort at first, restlessness, doubt, loneliness. These are withdrawal symptoms from validation dependency. But beneath them, something stabilizes. The self begins to feel solid again. Decisions are no longer shaped by fear of loss. Boundaries are no longer arguments waiting to happen. Presence becomes calm, not performative. The unconscious of others responds immediately, without explanation, without confrontation, without drama. The dynamic either corrects itself or collapses. Some people step closer, sensing the regained gravity. Others drift away, unable to engage without leverage. Both outcomes are information. Neither requires pursuit. When someone no longer chases, they are no longer asking to be chosen. They are observing who chooses freely. This observation changes everything. There is a moment when chasing exhausts itself, and something more subtle takes its place. It is not dramatic, and it is rarely acknowledged. It appears as explanation, as the careful arrangement of words meant to soften reality, as the instinct to clarify intentions before they are questioned, to justify feeling before they are challenged, to defend boundaries before they are crossed. The individual believes they are being reasonable, transparent, emotionally intelligent, but beneath the surface, the psyche is attempting to manage perception. It is trying to control how it is received in order to avoid discomfort, conflict, or rejection. Explanation becomes a form of self-protection, not self-expression. The unconscious does not experience explanations as clarity. It experiences them as doubt. When someone feels compelled to explain who they are, what they meant, or why they acted a certain way, it suggests that their inner authority has already been compromised. Something in them believes their truth is unstable unless reinforced by agreement. This belief trains the psyche to look outward for confirmation rather than inward for alignment. Over time, the individual begins to preemptively apologize for existing as they are. They soften statements. They over-contextualize decisions. They narrate their emotional landscape as if it must be approved before it can be inhabited. What is lost in this process is weight. Words lose gravity when they arrive wrapped in justification. Boundaries lose force when they are delivered with explanations meant to make them palatable. The listener is subtly invited to negotiate, interpret or dismiss what is being said. The unconscious exchange becomes asymmetrical. One side offers their inner world for inspection. The other assumes the role of judge. This dynamic is rarely intentional, yet once established, it is difficult to reverse. The more someone explains, the more they are expected to continue explaining. Silence begins to feel like guilt. Restraint begins to feel like cruelty. Begging, in this sense, is not always visible desperation. Often it is psychological. It is the need to be understood by those who have already decided not to understand. It is the hope that one more clarification will unlock empathy, that one more emotional disclosure will produce care, that one more attempt will restore balance. But explanation given to the unwilling does not create connection. It creates exposure. The individual reveals more of themselves while receiving less in return. This imbalance feeds a quiet resentment, which the conscious mind often suppresses. In the name of harmony, the psyche registers this suppression as self-betrayal. Each time an individual explains themselves past the point of being heard, they teach their nervous system that their needs are secondary. Over time, the body responds with tension, fatigue, and emotional numbness. The person may feel confused, unsure why interactions leave them drained rather than connected. They may blame themselves for not communicating better, not being patient enough, not choosing the right words. Rarely do they consider that the problem is not how much they are explaining, but why. They feel compelled to explain at all. Silence, when it finally arrives, is not passive. It is an interruption of pattern. When the individual stops filling the space with justification, the dynamic destabilizes. The other person is no longer guided, reassured, or softened. They are left alone with their interpretation. This can feel threatening because explanation has been functioning as emotional cushioning. Without it, reality becomes sharper. Reactions become more honest. The individual begins to see who respects their presence without persuasion and who depended on access without accountability. Silence is often misinterpreted as withdrawal or punishment, but psychologically it is containment. It holds energy rather than dispersing it. When a person chooses not to react immediately, not to clarify, not to defend, they reclaim authorship over their internal state. They stop performing emotional labor for outcomes they cannot control. This containment shifts the internal hierarchy. Instead of asking, "How can I be understood?" the psyche begins to ask, "What do I feel when I stop explaining?" The answer is rarely comfortable at first. Anxiety surfaces, guilt surfaces, old fears of abandonment re-emerge. But beneath them, there is relief. The unconscious of others responds powerfully to this shift. Humans are attuned to energetic cues long before verbal ones. When someone stops reacting, it creates a pause that demands interpretation. The absence of explanation becomes a mirror. People project into the silence what they have avoided acknowledging. Some experience discomfort and attempt to reassert control through provocation or guilt. Others become curious, reflective, even self-critical. The silence reveals far more than words ever could because it removes the script. In this vacuum, roles are renegotiated. The individual who once over-explained is no longer positioning themselves as subordinate to interpretation. They are no longer seeking validation through transparency. Their silence signals internal cohesion. It communicates that their reality exists without external approval. This does not require detachment or coldness. It requires trust in one's own experience. The psyche begins to feel anchored again. Emotional responses become slower, more deliberate. The urge to rescue the dynamic through words diminishes. What emerges is discernment. Instead of reacting to every misunderstanding, the individual observes. Instead of rushing to restore harmony, they allow discomfort to exist. This patience is not indifference, it is respect for the truth of the moment. Some connections strengthen under this honesty, others unravel. The unraveling can feel like loss, but it is more accurately a revelation. Relationships sustained by explanation rather than reciprocity cannot survive silence because they were never grounded in mutual recognition. Silence also confronts the individual with themselves. Without the distraction of managing perception, they are left with their own boundaries, desires, and values. They begin to notice how often they abandon themselves to maintain connection. This awareness can be painful. It requires mourning the version of the self that believed endurance would be rewarded. But it also restores agency. The individual learns that they do not need to convince others of their worth. They need to inhabit it. As silence becomes integrated, it transforms from a reaction into a stance. The individual no longer withholds words to elicit response. They simply speak when alignment exists. When they do speak, their words carry clarity because they are not diluted by fear. There is no urgency in their tone, no compulsion to persuade. The psyche has recalibrated. It understands that being misunderstood is not a threat to identity. Being disrespected is. The greatest shift occurs internally. The self that once begged for understanding now listens to itself. Emotional energy returns home. The nervous system settles. Interactions feel cleaner, less charged. The individual recognizes that silence is not the absence of connection but the presence of self-respect. It allows reality to unfold without interference. It reveals intention, depth, and capacity without demand. It does not chase truth. It waits for it to surface. When the individual no longer chases, begs, or explains, a quiet reorganization takes place within the psyche. It is not announced. There is no external marker to validate it. Yet internally, something settles into alignment. Energy that once scattered outward in attempts to manage perception, secure reassurance, or repair imbalance returns to its origin. The self begins to feel dense again, grounded, less porous. This density is often mistaken for detachment by those who benefit from the earlier openness, but internally it feels like coherence. The person is no longer leaking emotional energy into situations that do not reciprocate it. This internal shift changes how identity is experienced. The individual stops defining themselves through response. They are no longer calibrated by how quickly someone replies, how warmly they are received, or how much effort is required to be acknowledged. Instead, identity becomes self-referential. Feelings are felt without immediately being shared. Thoughts are examined before being offered. Boundaries are sensed before they are spoken. This inward orientation restores authority. The psyche begins to trust its own signals again because they are no longer overridden by the fear of losing connection. As this trust returns, presence changes. There is less performative warmth and more grounded calm. The body language softens but stabilizes. Eye contact becomes steadier, not seeking, not defensive. Speech becomes slower, more deliberate, because there is no rush to fill space. People around this individual often sense the change without able to name it. Conversations feel different. There is more listening, less explaining, more observation, less justification. The individual is no longer trying to be perceived in a certain way. They are simply occupying their space. This shift alters relational dynamics in predictable ways. Those who were accustomed to unrestricted access may feel unsettled. They may interpret the new restraint as distance or withdrawal because the emotional supply has changed. The individual no longer offers immediate reassurance, emotional labor, or self-disclosure on demand. This is not withholding, it is discernment. The psyche is learning to differentiate between connection and consumption. Relationships that relied on one-sided effort begin to reveal their structure. Some adapt, adjusting to mutual respect. Others resist, attempting to restore the old pattern through guilt, urgency, or confusion. The result is clarity, not the clarity that comes from explanation, but the clarity that comes from observation. Without chasing or correcting the dynamic, the individual sees who meets them halfway and who only advances when pursued. This information is absorbed quietly. Decisions are made internally before they are expressed externally. The individual no longer negotiates their reality in real time. They allow behavior to speak. They trust pattern over promise. This trust in observation marks a mature psychological stance. It signals that the self no longer needs to be convinced of WJ. It is witnessing. With this maturity comes selectivity. The individual becomes more intentional about where they place attention, time, and emotional investment. This selectivity is not arrogance, it is conservation. Emotional energy is finite, and the psyche recognizes that dispersing it indiscriminately leads to depletion. By choosing where to engage, the individual protects their inner equilibrium. Interactions become cleaner. Conflict, when it arises, is addressed without over-explanation. Silence is used not as a weapon, but as a boundary. The nervous system remains regulated because it is no longer forced in. Constant adaptation approach, in this context, is not strategy, It is posture. It is the way the individual moves through interactions without rehearsing outcome. They do not enter conversations to secure approval or prevent loss. They enter to exchange presence. When alignment is felt, they lean in naturally. When misalignment appears, they do not rush to fix it. They allow space. This space is informative. It shows whether the other can tolerate autonomy, whether they respect difference, whether they can meet without control. The individual does not test. They observe. This approach also reshapes how boundaries function. Boundaries are no longer defended through explanation. They are lived. When crossed, the response is proportionate and calm. The individual may reduce availability, shift tone, or disengage without announcement. These actions are not punitive. They are communicative. They signal that access is contingent on respect. Because there is no emotional charge attached, the message is clear. Those who can adjust do. Those who cannot reveal their limitation. The individual accepts both outcomes without self-doubt. Internally, the psyche continues to stabilize. The fear of being misunderstood loses its grip. The individual realizes that misunderstanding is inevitable when one no longer performs. Not everyone has access to the same depth of perception. This realization removes the compulsion to translate oneself endlessly. The individual becomes comfortable being known selectively. They share their inner world with those who demonstrate care through consistency, not curiosity. This selectivity deepens intimacy where it exists and removes the illusion of intimacy where it does not. As silence becomes integrated into the individual's approach, it no longer feels like restraint. It feels like choice. Words are used intentionally, not reflexively. Emotional expression becomes grounded rather than reactive. The individual can sit with discomfort without immediately trying to resolve it. This capacity creates psychological resilience. The self is no longer fragmented by every relational fluctuation. It remains centered even when outcomes are uncertain. This centering is perceived by others as confidence, though internally it feels like peace. The most profound result is the restoration of self-respect, not the kind that demands recognition, but the kind that operates quietly. The individual no longer compromises their inner truth for external harmony. They are willing to let connections fade if they require self-abandonment to survive. This willingness is not coldness, it is alignment. It signals that the individual values internal coherence over external approval. From this place, relationships that form are rooted in mutual recognition rather than need. Over time, the individual notices that life responds differently. Opportunities, conversations, and connections arise without pursuit. This is not coincidence. It is the natural response to grounded presence. When the self is no longer scattered, it becomes magnetic. People sense stability and are drawn to it, but even this attraction is no longer chase. The individual remains selective, responsive rather than reactive. They engage without losing themselves. They withdraw without guilt. They move through the world anchored, allowing silence to carry what words once tried to force. Never chase because what is meant to meet you walks willingly. Never beg because what honors you does not require collapse. Never explain because truth does not shout. And when you master silence, you don't disappear.